Welcome back to Quiet History by Sam. Tonight, we are traveling back to Southeast Asia during one of the most complicated periods of the 20th century. The Vietnam War is often remembered through dramatic photographs, powerful speeches, and stories of fierce battles. But tonight, we will leave those moments behind. Instead, we will quietly explore a different question. Why did the United States become involved in Vietnam in the first place? The answer is not found in a single event. It was the result of decades of political change, colonial history, global rivalry, and decisions made by leaders who believed they were protecting the future. So, find a comfortable place to rest, take a slow breath, and let us begin our journey. Long before American soldiers set foot in Vietnam, the country had already experienced many centuries of foreign rule. For almost 1,000 years, different Chinese dynasties governed much of Vietnam. Although Vietnam eventually regained its independence, the desire to protect its own identity remained deeply rooted in its people. Centuries later, another foreign power arrived. During the 19th century, France gradually took control of Vietnam, along with Laos and Cambodia. Together, these territories became known as French Indochina. French colonial rule brought railways, schools, and new businesses. But these developments mainly benefited the colonial administration rather than most Vietnamese people. Many farmers struggled with heavy taxes. Large areas of farmland were controlled by wealthy landowners. Important political decisions were made in Paris instead of Hanoi or Saigon. As the years passed, more Vietnamese began hoping for independence. Some wanted peaceful reform. Others believed only armed resistance could remove colonial rule. One of those young Vietnamese was a man named Ho Chi Minh. As a young man, he traveled across Europe and later spent time in the Soviet Union and China. During those years, he became interested in communist political ideas. But above all, he wanted Vietnam to become an independent nation. Historians note that Ho Chi Minh combined Vietnamese nationalism with communist ideology, making his movement both anti-colonial and revolutionary. When the Second World War began, Japan occupied much of Vietnam while allowing French colonial officials to continue administering parts of the country. During this difficult period, Ho Chi Minh organized a resistance movement called the Viet Minh. Their goal was simple: end foreign rule, create an independent Vietnam. When Japan surrendered in 1945, a political vacuum appeared across the country. Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam independent. However, France hoped to reclaim its former colony. Soon, another conflict began. This time, it was not World War II. It was a struggle over Vietnam's future. Would Vietnam become an independent nation under Ho Chi Minh, or would France restore its colonial control? For nearly 8 years, fighting continued between French forces and the Viet Minh. Finally, in 1954, everything changed. French forces suffered a decisive defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The battle shocked governments around the world. For France, it marked the end of its colonial ambitions in Indochina. For Vietnam, it opened the door to a new but uncertain future. The defeat of France in 1954 did not immediately bring peace to Vietnam. Instead, world leaders gathered in the quiet Swiss city of Geneva to discuss the country's future. Representatives from several nations hoped they could prevent another long and costly war. After weeks of negotiations, an agreement was reached. Vietnam would be temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. The northern half would be governed by Ho Chi Minh and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The southern half would be administered separately until nationwide elections could be held in 1956. The partition was never intended to become a permanent border. It was meant to give both sides time to prepare for peaceful reunification through elections. For many Vietnamese families, however, politics suddenly became deeply personal. Parents, children, brothers, and sisters found themselves living on opposite sides of the new dividing line. Some believed the North offered the best hope for an independent future. Others feared communist rule and chose to move south. During the months that followed, hundreds of thousands of people packed their belongings and left their homes. Some traveled by boat, others rode crowded trucks or walked for days. Many did not know if they would ever return. Villages that had existed for generations suddenly became quieter. Markets lost familiar faces. Schools welcomed children who had never expected to leave their hometowns. For ordinary people, these were not simply political events. They were life-changing decisions. Many hoped the division would last only a short time. After all, elections were expected in 1956. If the agreement worked, Vietnam could become one nation again without another major war. But history rarely follows its most peaceful path. As the months passed, trust between the two governments began to disappear. International tensions grew stronger. The Cold War was reaching almost every corner of the world. Vietnam was no longer only about Vietnam. It was becoming part of something much larger. To understand why America became interested in Vietnam, we must leave Southeast Asia for a moment Imagine the world during the 1950s. The Second World War had ended, but another global struggle had already begun. This new conflict was called the Cold War. Unlike the World Wars, the Cold War was usually not fought through direct battles between the United States and the Soviet Union. Instead, it became a competition of ideas, influence, alliances, technology, and political systems. On one side stood the United States and many of its allies. They believed in democratic government on the market-based economies. On the other side stood the Soviet Union and its communist allies. Each side feared the growing influence of the other. American leaders worried that if communism continued spreading into new countries, it would change the global balance of power. This concern became known as the policy of containment. The goal was not necessarily to defeat communism everywhere. Instead, it was to prevent it from expanding into additional countries. When France lost control of Indochina in 1954, many officials in Washington viewed the situation through this Cold War perspective. President Dwight D. Eisenhower and several of his advisors believed that if South Vietnam became communist, neighboring countries might eventually follow. This idea became famous as the Domino Theory. Picture a long row of standing dominoes. Push the first one, then the next falls, and then another. Eventually, the entire row collapses. American policymakers feared Southeast Asia might behave in the same way. If Vietnam became communist, perhaps Laos would follow, then Cambodia, perhaps Thailand, maybe even Malaysia or Indonesia. Whether this prediction would eventually prove correct is still debated by historians today. But during the 1950s, many American leaders sincerely believed the danger was real. That belief influenced almost every major decision they made about Vietnam. Because of this, the United States did not initially send large numbers of combat soldiers. Instead, Washington began with financial assistance, military equipment, economic aid, and military advisors. American leaders hoped these measures would strengthen South Vietnam without requiring a full-scale war. At the time, few people imagined that this limited commitment would eventually grow into one of the largest and most controversial conflicts in modern American history. For now, it still seemed possible that careful planning and limited support might prevent a much larger war. But events inside South Vietnam would soon become far more complicated than anyone expected. The government of South Vietnam now faced an enormous challenge. Although it had received international recognition from many Western countries, gaining the trust of its own people proved far more difficult. Leading the government was Nguyen Dinh Diem, a man known for his strong anti-communist beliefs. The United States viewed him as someone who might help build a stable, independent South Vietnam. With American financial assistance and advice, his administration began constructing new government institutions, expanding the military, and strengthening its authority. At first, many officials in Washington believed they had chosen the right partner, but governing a divided country was never simple. South Vietnam was home to people from many different backgrounds, religions, and political beliefs. Some welcomed the new government, others remained uncertain, and some quietly supported the communist movement in the north. President Diem believed strong central control would protect the country from instability. His government introduced new security measures and tried to weaken communist influence in rural villages. Yet many of these policies also created resentment. Some farmers felt ignored. Some religious groups believed they were treated unfairly. Others complained that local officials were more interested in loyalty than competence. For ordinary villagers, daily life often changed very little. Rice fields still needed tending. Children still walked to school. Families still gathered around evening meals. But politics has slowly entered everyday life. People became more careful about what they said. Conversations grew quieter. Trust became harder to find. Meanwhile, in Washington, American advisors sent regular reports back home. They described progress in some areas. New roads had been built. Military training continued. Government offices expanded. Yet they also warned that many rural communities remained vulnerable to insurgent activity. The picture was becoming increasingly complicated. On paper, South Vietnam appeared to be growing stronger. In reality, many underlying problems remained unresolved. American leaders found themselves facing an uncomfortable question. Could economic aid and military advisors alone secure the future of South Vietnam? Or would even greater involvement eventually become necessary? At this stage, few people imagined sending hundreds of thousands of American soldiers across the Pacific Ocean. The hope was still that South Vietnam could defend itself with outside assistance rather than direct American combat forces. It was a cautious strategy, a limited commitment, or at least that was the intention. But history often moves in unexpected directions. Events inside Vietnam would soon begin unfolding faster than diplomats, generals, and presidents could control. And with every passing year, the decision became more difficult. The United States had entered Vietnam step by step, not through one dramatic decision, but through many smaller choices. Each one seemed reasonable at the time. Together, they slowly created a path that became increasingly difficult to leave behind. In our next episode, we will explore how those early decisions gradually drew America deeper into Vietnam. We'll follow the growing insurgency in the South, the arrival of additional American advisors, the political crises inside Saigon, and the events that eventually transformed limited involvement into a much larger conflict. Until then, thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through history. Rest well, and I hope to see you again in our next story.